Hello and welcome to another episode of Blood, Guts, and Social Commentary. We're going to take a small detour from straight up talking about horror movies to just talking about controversial art in general. This series will include books, music, movies, anything that you can call art. This first video is not going to have a mature content filter. The reason being is all of the pieces I will discuss in this first video are classic, they're not really debatable as fine art, so I'm gonna just assume everybody's mature enough to see an artistic nude. We're gonna start in 1538 with Titan, Venus of Urbino. This piece was originally very controversial for a few reasons. First off, you normally don't see Venuses portrayed this way. This is clearly just a regular woman, not a goddess. Also, her staring out of her bedroom at you is very risque for the time period. 1759, Voltaire candidate. Almost immediately after this was released, it got banned. Mostly due to its satirical attacks on both politics and religion. Overall, it questions why a benevolent god would wreak havoc on the world. This is not a topic that was considered even remotely for the time period and is still hot button today. 1793, The Death of Marat. This painting depicts John Paul Marat dead in a medical bath. He had a medical bath due to a skin condition. He was murdered by Charlotte Cordier, sorry, I'm really rusty at other languages, who blames him for the September massacres. She felt killing him would avoid an all-out civil war. Considering the detail of this work and the fact it was so heavily political, led to a lot of controversy. Also, just overall, a dead body is not the best subject matter for a portrait. Goya, the 3rd of May, 1808, but this painting comes from 1814. Instead of showing the glory of war, this shows the horrors of it. And when you're trying to get a country to go to war, you really don't want to show how terrible it is. 1818, The Raft of Medusa. This depicts the events of the Medusa, a warship that ran aground. 147 plus people had to get on a quickly constructed raft. All but 15 died before a rescue ship found them. In this painting, you can clearly see the malnourished survivors sitting atop a pile of corpses. This was an extreme painting for the time, but it was also hailed as helping start the Romantic movement. 1840, J.M.W. Turner, The Slave Ship. This painting depicts slave traders throwing the dead and dying overboard to collect the drowning insurance. This was controversial for the time period because a lot of people didn't realize drowning insurance existed. If a slaver had a sick or a dying slave, it wasn't uncommon for them to throw them overboard and say they drowned by accident. To these slavers, these human beings were worth more dead than alive. 1863, Manet's Olympia. Manet is probably not an artist people expected to see on this list, but this piece was incredibly controversial. The woman laying nude is very clearly and very unapologetically a prostitute. Just like Venus of Urbino, she is staring directly at the viewer. In this case, it's a very clear invitation for sex, which in 1865 was still incredibly controversial and probably would be today. Also, her servant's gaze can imply a homosexual and interracial relationship between the two, which would have seriously been frowned upon in 1863, and among certain groups, it'd be controversial today. 1875, The Gross Clinic. Keep in mind that Da Vinci had to rob graves to autopsy the bodies just because you weren't supposed to or allowed to autopsy. Seeing one depicted in this kind of detail is drastic and shocking for the time period. 1877, Swan Lake. Ballet wasn't so much controversial as poorly received in its time period. It was considered too loud and too complicated for the time, and due to some poor management, it was lost for a pretty long period of time. Now it's possibly one of the most recognizable ballets in the world. 1879, Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House. I'm not going to spoiler tag me explaining this play, so if you'd like to see it and want nothing ruined for you, I'd suggest skipping this section. The play centers around Nora. She's married to a wealthy man and has 2 children by him. Nora is hiding the fact that she borrowed money from a less than reputable man and has been secretly paying him off. The lender threatens to expose the entire thing to Nora's husband. When a letter is sent revealing all that happened, Nora's husband becomes belligerent, says they will continue to remain married in name only, but they are no longer romantically together, just for the sake of the children. Another note arrives saying the lender has changed his mind. and will not expose everything, and Nora's husband goes back to, oh, we're good. With this change in reaction, Nora quickly realizes that her husband actually doesn't love or care about her. She realized she also went from her father's house to her husband's house and has never really been independent and on her own. Because of this, she chooses to leave her family. The play is controversial because in 1879, her borrowing money without her husband knowing was an issue. It would have been an insult to him, saying he couldn't provide, even though the reason for it was he was in poor health and she just needed something to get by. She realizes she had no business really raising her children if she hadn't been out and experienced the world. So her leaving her family was incredibly controversial for the time period, to the point where Ibsen actually had to write an alternate ending to the play, where Nora just passes out and nothing really happens after the second letter comes. So she never gives a speech about how she's leaving her family. Because of this work, though, Ibsen is hailed as a feminist long before that term even existed. 1881, Heinrich Ibsen again with Ghosts. Again, if you want nothing in this play spoiled for you, I would suggest skipping ahead. In this play, the character of Oswald keeps making sexual advances towards the maid Regina. The issue with this is Regina is in fact his half-sister because she is Oswald's father's illegitimate child. Oswald is also dying of syphilis that he contracted in the womb from his mother, and she got from her husband repeatedly cheating on her. Ibsen addresses incest, adultery, and venereal disease, all of which were extremely taboo topics for the time and still continue on to this day. 1907, Pablo Picasso. Prostitutes are typically not regarded very highly in society, so Picasso's choice to portray 5 of them. 2 of these figures were actually originally supposed to be men, but he changed it to all women. It was an incredibly risky endeavor. Their blocky figures and phallic objects around them only add to the negative reaction of this piece. It's now hailed as one of his most famous works. 1912, Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase No. 2. Duchamp's brothers asked him to voluntarily withdraw this piece from exhibition because, according to them, a nude never descends the stairs, a nude reclines. And as we've seen from previous nudes in this series, that's pretty much true of the time period. 1913, Rite of Spring. This is possibly the weirdest entry on this first video. With inharmonic notes accompanied by a bizarre bassoon composition, this caused the first audience to hear it to boo. But it gets better. The audience actually rioted. Those that booed argued with those that didn't. Eventually punches were thrown and a full-scale riot ensued. Not too shabby for a classical piece that's now been used in Disney films. 1915, D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation. This movie is cited as causing a rebirth in the Klan that had started to die out before its release. This ended up also being used as a recruitment film for the KKK. Problem is, while the byproducts of it are horrific, most people hail this film as being very technically sound, and it's almost impossible to get through any kind of course on film without having to discuss it. Fortunately, it's fallen into public domain, and I will link an archive.org link in the description so you can watch it if you so choose. 1917, Marcel Duchamp is back once again with The Fountain. As you can see, this piece is just a urinal hung up in a gallery. This was a very early entry into the Dada movement, and it was one of the most notable of the ready-made sculpture movement. This is still debatable as to whether it's art or not today, because it raises the question, is something art just because it's signed and put in a gallery, or is it art because the intent behind it is to be artistic? 1929, Dali with Unchained Angelou. Sorry if I mispronounced that. This film had one rule: nothing could be symbolic. All of these scenes attempt to show suppressed human thought. The scenes were all jumbled up and follow no order. The 2 most notable and debatably most repulsive scenes in the film involved a person having their eye cut with a straight razor and somebody having a hole in their hand with ants crawling out of it. This was a huge hit with Surrealists. The general public, however, didn't react so well. 1931, Brave New World. This book about a dystopian future has been banned multiple times on the grounds of having sexually explicit scenes, language that is offensive, and overall insensitivity. This concludes the first in the controversial art series. Next week we'll pick up at 1932 with Todd Browning's Freeze. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please hit like and subscribe. If you don't like, what you're hearing, I butchered your language, or I missed your favorite piece, please feel free to comment and let me know. Thank you.